We are KB and Jasmine, and welcome to Beyond the Silver Screen.
Welcome to our deep dive. You ready to go deep on George Lucas?
Oh, yeah. Let's talk Lucas.
So we're going way past Star Wars today.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would be surprised to find out just how much more there is to this guy's story. I mean, he's way more than just the guy who created lightsabers.
He really is. It's like you think you know him because of Star Wars, but then you dig a little deeper and you realize he's this incredibly complex, fascinating figure.
Exactly. So to kick things off,
Yeah.
where do we even begin with a guy like George Lucas?
Well, like a lot of great stories, his starts in a place you wouldn't exactly expect, Modesto, California.
Modesto, not exactly the Hollywood Hills, right?
Nope, not even close. Small town kind of place.
Why?
And that's where young George, well, he wasn't exactly a model student, more into hot rods and comic books than homework.
Sounds kind of like the classic rebel stereotype.
He definitely had that streak in him. And get this, his dad wanted him to take over the family business, the family stationery business.
Wait, so the guy who dreamed up Star Wars was almost stuck selling envelopes and paper clips.
Can you imagine?
That's hilarious. But hey, maybe that's where his whole anti-establishment vibe comes from.
Yeah.
You know, always pushing against what's expected.
It's possible. I mean, even as a kid, he was drawn to telling stories, but visually.
Right.
Like, he loved those old Scrooge McDuck comics by Carl Barks.
Scrooge McDuck.
Yeah.
Okay, now that's interesting. What was it about those stories that grabbed him?
I think it was more than just the adventures. It was also about being self-made, learning to be financially independent. Scrooge was this, self-made tycoon, and I think that resonated with Lucas.
That makes sense, especially when you consider how he later built his own empire with Lucasfilm and all that. He was definitely all about creative control and doing things his own way.
And he learned early on how to be entrepreneurial. Remember, he ran his own little newspaper as a kid, the Weekly Bugle. He and his friend were out there hustling, learning about business firsthand.
So it's like those early experiences really laid the groundwork for everything that came later. It wasn't just about the art, it was also about the business of storytelling.
Exactly. And speaking of art, another thing that really fascinated him were those Norman Rockwell illustrations.
Oh, I love Norman Rockwell. Those classic Americana images.
Yeah.
So wholesome and full of detail.
Right. And Lucas was obsessed with trying to figure out the whole story behind each image just from looking at it. Like what happened before and what's going to happen next.
Talk about visual storytelling. It's like he was training his brain to think in cinematic terms even back then.
It's amazing when you think about it, like all these seemingly random interests, comics, illustrations, they were all feeding into his development as a visual storyteller.
And of course, we can't forget about movies. Wasn't he a huge fan of those old Flash Gordon serials?
Oh, yeah. Big time. Those are like his gateway drug to sci-fi. All those epic space battles, ray guns, alien planets. It's classic Lucas territory.
It's so funny how those cheesy old serials ended up inspiring some of the most iconic films of all time.
Well, he didn't just watch them, he absorbed them. Like, he really studied how they built suspense, how they used visual effects, how they created these whole worlds.
So it's like he was taking mental notes all along, filing away ideas that he'd later use in his own work.
Exactly. And what's even crazier is that his childhood trip to Disneyland kind of foreshadowed his future, too. You know how obsessed he was with creating immersive experiences with Star Wars?
Yeah, those theme park rides are insane. So realistic. It's like you're actually stepping into the movies.
Well, even as a kid, he was fascinated by that kind of thing. Like, he loved the Rocket to the Moon ride and how they use screens to make you feel like you're actually flying through space.
That's wild. So it's like those early experiences with film and even theme parks were shaping his ideas about what storytelling could be.
Totally. He was already thinking about how to create these immersive worlds that you could step into.
But it wasn't all spaceships and aliens. He also had this other big passion, cars.
Oh, yeah. Lucas was a total gearhead. He loved tinkering with engines, souping up cars, and just cruising around Modesto in his Fiat beyond China.
So the creator of the Millennium Falcon was first a grease monkey. That's pretty cool.
He wasn't just a casual mechanic either. He was actually into racing, like pushing those cars to their limits.
Which is kind of ironic considering how much of a control freak he was when it came to filmmaking. It's like he needed that outlet for risk-taking before he channeled all his energy into movies.
It's an interesting contrast for sure. But this is where things take a bit of a darker turn. He had a pretty serious car accident when he was younger.
Oh, wow. Really? I never knew that.
Yeah, it was a near-death experience, and it really shook him up, made him rethink his whole life.
I can only imagine. That kind of thing really puts things into perspective, makes you realize how fragile life is.
Exactly. And for Lucas, it seems like that accident was a turning point. It made him start thinking about other paths that weren't so dangerous.
So it's like fate or maybe his own intuition stepped in and steered him away from racing and towards filmmaking.
It definitely seems that way. After the crash, he ended up enrolling in film school at USC almost by chance.
Almost by chance, huh? So it wasn't like this lifelong dream to become a director.
Well, his dad actually didn't want him to be an artist, so he kind of steered him towards cinema instead.
The irony. His dad tries to push him towards a more practical career, and he ends up creating one of the biggest film franchises in history.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. And USC back then was like a breeding ground for future Hollywood legends.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about the USC Mafia. Wasn't that what they called that group of filmmakers who all came out of USC around the same time?
That's the one. John Milius, Walter Murch, Randall Kleiser, and of course, George Lucas. They were all there bouncing ideas off each other, pushing the boundaries of filmmaking.
Wow, that must have been an incredible environment to be a part of. It's like the Avengers of cinema all assembled in one place.
Exactly. And even in those early days, Lucas's talent was obvious. He was already experimenting with different genres and styles, showing his visual flair and that knack for storytelling.
So what were his early films like? Anything that hinted at the kind of filmmaker he would become?
Well, one of his first films was called Freiheit. It was an anti-war piece, which kind of foreshadowed some of the social commentary he'd later explore in films like THX 1138.
So we're already seeing those themes of rebellion and questioning authority emerge pretty early on.
Definitely. And he also made a documentary about race car driving called 1.42.08.
Of course he did. The guy loved cars.
It's like all these pieces of his life, those early passions and experiences were starting to come together to shape him as a filmmaker.
So we've got visual storytelling, a rebellious spirit, a love of sci-fi, and a fascination with technology. It's all starting to fall into place.
It really is. But how did he go from student films to making actual feature films? That's a pretty big leap.
Well, stay tuned because that's where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah. This is where we enter the world of Francis Ford Coppola and the birth of a cinematic revolution.
Ooh, I can't wait to hear about that. We'll dive into all of that in part 2 of our deep dive on George Lucas.
See then?
See ya.
Okay, so last time we left off with George Lucas fresh out of film school and ready to take on Hollywood.
And I'm guessing Hollywood wasn't exactly welcoming him with open arms.
Not really. He had this very distinct vision, and the studio system back then was all about playing it safe, sticking to formulas.
So how did he manage to break through with all that resistance?
Well, it's kind of funny, actually. The studio was pushing him to make something lighter, something more commercial. And that's how we got American Graffiti.
American Graffiti. That's such a classic. I mean, it perfectly captures that whole cruising culture. The nostalgia, the energy of being young and restless.
It really does. And it's no coincidence that Lucas drew a lot of inspiration from his own teenage years in Modesto. He even filmed some of the scenes on the actual streets he used to cruise down.
Wow. So he basically poured his own memories and experiences into the film.
He did. And I think that's why it feels so authentic, so relatable. It's like a time capsule of those carefree days before the Vietnam War and all the turmoil of the late 60s.
And the studio was totally on board with this idea.
Not at first. They wanted him to make a warm human comedy. That's what they called it. But Lucas saw it as an opportunity to prove he could do more than just sci-fi and dystopian stuff. He wanted to show his range.
And he definitely did. American Graffiti was a huge hit, both critically and commercially. It won awards and put Lucas on the map.
It did. It was like his calling card to the world. It said, hey, I can make these fun, crowd-pleasing movies, too.
And it's amazing to think that a film like that, so personal, so rooted in nostalgia, was the springboard to Star Wars. Talk about a leap.
It is a pretty big jump, but even in American Graffiti, you can see some of those elements that would later become hallmarks of Star Wars. The great characters, the visual storytelling, that sense of youthful energy.
So the seeds were already there.
Yeah.
Just waiting to be planted in a galaxy far, far away.
Exactly. So let's talk about Star Wars. Where did this idea come from? How did he even dream up something so unique and groundbreaking?
That's what I want to know. It's such a departure from everything else he'd done up to that point.
Well, the thing is, Star Wars wasn't just one idea. It was like a fusion of all these different influences, mythology, classic sci-fi samurai films, even the Vietnam War.
Wait, the Vietnam War? How does that fit into Star Wars?
Think about the themes, the rebels fighting against a powerful empire, the struggle for freedom. It's all there. It adds this layer of depth and complexity to the story.
Wow. You're totally right. I never thought about it that way.
Hmm.
But yeah, those themes definitely resonate in Star Wars.
And then you've got the obvious stuff, like those old Flash Gordon serials that Lucas loved as a kid, all those space battles, ray guns, alien planets. It's classic Star Wars DNA.
So it's like he took all these things, he loved these stories that inspired him and blended them together to create something completely new.
Exactly. He didn't just copy, he transformed. He took those familiar tropes and archetypes and gave them a fresh spin,
And set them in a galaxy far, far away.
of course. But it wasn't all smooth sailing getting Star Wars made. The script went through multiple revisions, and some of the characters we know and love were very different in those early drafts.
Really, still the T. What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, in one version, the main character wasn't even named Luke Skywalker. He was Anakin Starkiller.
Anakin Starkiller. That's wild. It's hard to imagine Star Wars without Luke.
And Darth Vader was a minor character in some versions.
Seriously. That's crazy to think about. It just goes to show how much a story can evolve during the writing process.
It really does. And even Luke wasn't always the farm boy we know and love. In some drafts, he was General Luke Skywalker, a grizzled older warrior.
My mind is blown. So it's like the Star Wars we know almost didn't happen.
In a way, yeah. But thankfully, Lucas kept refining his vision until he got it right.
And speaking of vision, how did he even manage to make Star Wars back then? The special effects must have been a nightmare.
Oh, it was a huge challenge. But Lucas was determined to create this believable, lived-in universe, what he called a used universe.
A used universe. What does that even mean?
Well, most sci-fi films back then were all sleek and futuristic with shiny spaceships and spotless uniforms. But Lucas wanted Star Wars to feel gritty, worn, like this galaxy had seen its fair share of battles and adventures.
It's like he wanted to create a world that felt real, a world with a history and a texture.
Exactly. He wanted the audience to believe that this place actually existed. And to achieve that, he used a combination of practical effects, miniatures, matte paintings, and some really innovative camera techniques.
So he was pushing the boundaries of what was possible with filmmaking back then.
He absolutely was. And his team at ILM, they worked tirelessly to bring his vision to life. They invented new technologies, developed new techniques. It was groundbreaking stuff.
It's amazing to think that he created an entire special effects company just to make Star Wars. That's dedication.
It is, and that's part of what makes Lucas so remarkable. He wasn't just a director, he was an innovator, a problem solver, a force of nature.
And that drive, that determination led him to create Skywalker Ranch, right?
Exactly. He wanted to build this creative haven, a place where filmmakers could come together and collaborate and push the boundaries of storytelling without all the constraints of the traditional studio system.
It's like he was creating his own little Hollywood empire,
Hmm.
a place where he could have total control over his vision.
And that's exactly what he did. Skywalker Ranch became a symbol of his independent spirit and his unwavering commitment to the art of filmmaking.
But the success of Star Wars didn't just change the film industry, it changed Lucas's life. He became a global icon, a legend. And I can't imagine the pressure that comes with that.
Oh, yeah. The weight of those expectations must have been immense, especially when you consider that Star Wars wasn't just a movie. It became this cultural phenomenon, this mythology that people deeply connected with.
So how did he handle all that? How did he navigate the challenges of fame and fortune and the legacy of Star Wars?
Well, that's a story for another time. But let's just say that Lucas's journey was far from over. He had more stories to tell, more worlds to create, and a few more surprises up his sleeve. So we left off with George Lucas at the top of the world. Star Wars had changed everything, and he was this, cinematic icon.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what do you do after you've achieved that level of success?
Mm-hmm.
Do you just try to recreate it, or do you forge a new path?
Well, in Lucas's case, it seems like he wanted to do both. He had more Star Wars stories he wanted to tell, but he also wanted to explore new ideas, new technologies.
And that's what led him to make the prequels, right? The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith.
Hmm.
Those films were a huge deal when they came out, but they also sparked a lot of debate among fans.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some people loved them, others not so much. They definitely had a different vibe than the original trilogy.
What do you think it was about the prequels that divided people so much?
Well, for one thing, they were much more reliant on CGI. Lucas was really pushing the boundaries of digital filmmaking at that time. And ILM, his special effects company, was creating some truly groundbreaking stuff.
I remember being blown away by the visuals in those films, especially the pod racing sequence in The Phantom Menace and the massive battle scenes in Attack of the Clones. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before.
But the reliance on CGI also meant that the films sometimes felt a bit too polished, a bit too artificial.
And there were some characters and dialogue choices that didn't quite land with everyone, shall we say, Jar Jar Binks, anyone.
Yeah, Jar Jar was definitely a misstep. But even with those criticisms, I think the prequels expanded the Star Wars universe in some interesting ways.
Like how?
Well, they explored the political complexities of the Republic's fall and the tragic downfall of Anakin Skywalker. They gave us a deeper understanding of the events that led to the original trilogy.
And they introduced a whole new generation to Star Wars, which is pretty impressive.
It is. But even with the prequels, Lucas never stopped exploring other ideas outside of the Star Wars universe.
Yeah, he made some really interesting films that often get overlooked, like Willow. That was a fun fantasy adventure, with great characters and some amazing creature designs.
And don't forget Radioland Murders. That was a charming little murder mystery set in the golden age of radio. It was very different from his other work, but you could still see his love of filmmaking shining through.
So even though he was the guy who created Star Wars, he wasn't afraid to experiment to try new things.
Not at all. He was always pushing himself creatively.
But eventually he made the decision to sell Lucasfilm to Disney in 2012. That was a huge moment in film history.
Yeah.
What do you think prompted that decision?
I think there were probably a few factors at play. He was getting older, and maybe he felt it was time to pass the torch to a new generation.
Plus, the prequels had faced a lot of criticism. Maybe he was feeling a bit burnt out on Star Wars.
That's possible. And Disney had the resources and the passion to continue the Star Wars saga in a way that he may not have been able to at that point.
And that sale led to the sequel trilogy, which, like the prequels, had its share of passionate fans and vocal critics.
It's interesting how Star Wars continues to evoke such strong emotions in people even decades after the original film was released.
It's a testament to the power of Lucas's creation, that it can still spark these kinds of debates and discussions.
Absolutely. And even beyond Star Wars, Lucas's legacy is undeniable. He changed the way we make movies, the way we tell stories.
He was a true visionary. He pushed technological boundaries, pioneered new filmmaking techniques, and created worlds that captured the imaginations of millions.
And he did it all on his own terms. He built his own empire, Skywalker Ranch, ILM. He was a true independent spirit.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and career of George Lucas, what are some of the key takeaways?
I think his story is a reminder that creativity and determination can take you incredible places.
He started as a kid obsessed with cars and movies, and he ended up changing the face of cinema.
He faced challenges, setbacks, disappointments, but he never gave up on his vision.
And he never stopped innovating, never stopped pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
He's an inspiration to anyone who wants to create something new, something meaningful, something that will stand the test of time.
Well said. So for you, listener, what's the biggest takeaway from George Lucas's story? What surprised you? What inspired you? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of George Lucas. Until next time, keep diving.